A millionaire in a crowded store stood frozen as the cashier's voice echoed, "Sir, your card has been declined." People turned their heads. Whispers rose, and eyes filled with disbelief. How could a man who was known for his endless wealth face such humiliation? No one knew that at this very moment his world was quietly falling apart. And it was not just about money. It was about something much deeper. Michael had built his empire brick by brick, starting from a small garage business, and everyone in town admired his rise. He wore expensive suits, drove the best cars, and lived in a mansion that many only saw in movies. Yet standing at the grocery counter with nothing but a few basic items in his cart, he felt smaller than he ever had. The woman behind him smirked, whispering to another, "Guess even rich men have bad days." Another man muttered, "Fraud, that's what they all are." Michael kept his head down, but inside his heart burned with shame. He tried to explain softly, "There must be some mistake. I'll call the bank." But his voice cracked, betraying his hidden despair. The cashier nodded without sympathy, her fingers tapping impatiently on the counter. The line behind him grew restless, sighs heavy with judgment. For a man who once signed million-dollar checks with ease, the weight of a few dollars felt like an unbearable burden. As he struggled with his phone, pretending to dial numbers that he already knew would lead to nowhere, a small voice broke through the noise. "Mister, I can pay for you." Michael turned sharply, his eyes landing on a boy no older than 9. The child's shoes were worn, his backpack patched in different places, and his hands clutched a few crumpled bills. Michael blinked, thinking he had misheard. "You want to pay for me?" Michael asked, almost in disbelief. The boy nodded with a shy smile. "Yeah, my mom says we should always help people." "You look like you need help." The people around chuckled under their breath, some rolling their eyes, others shaking their heads at the absurdity of a child offering help to a man worth millions. Michael's throat tightened, his pride warring with the sting of reality. He knelt down, his voice softer now. "Son, you don't have to do that. I should be the one helping you." The boy shrugged innocently. "But I want to. Maybe one day you can help me back." Michael's chest ached at the words. They sounded simple, but they carried a truth he had long forgotten, that kindness was not measured in dollars, but in heart. The cashier sighed impatiently. "So, are you paying or not?" The boy stepped forward bravely, laying down his crumpled bills on the counter. The room fell silent, every whisper swallowed by the sight of a child's sacrifice. Michael's hands trembled as he tried to stop him, but the boy smiled again. "It's okay, mister. My mom always says money comes and goes, but people, they don't." And in that moment, Michael realized that his biggest bankruptcy was not financial, it was emotional. Michael walked out of the store with trembling hands, clutching the small paper bag that held nothing more than a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a few apples. He had once signed deals worth more than what the entire store earned in a month, but today a little boy had paid for his survival. The world felt strangely heavy on his shoulders. His steps were slow, his eyes wet, but he kept wiping them before anyone could notice. His pride was already shattered enough. The boy followed him outside, still carrying his patched backpack. "Mister, you forgot your change," the boy said, holding out 2 coins that the cashier had given back. Michael stared at the coins as if they were gold. For the first time in years, money felt foreign to him, like a stranger he no longer understood. He whispered, "Keep it, son. You've already given me more than you know." The boy tilted his head. "But it's yours." Michael crouched down, looking into the child's eyes. "No," he said softly, "it's yours. Because you reminded me what really matters." The boy smiled faintly, then waved and began to walk away. Something inside Michael refused to let him just leave. "Wait," he called, his voice shaking. "What's your name?" "Daniel," the boy answered without turning back. Michael repeated the name under his breath, as though it was something sacred. Daniel. The name echoed in his mind, scraping old wounds that had never healed. His own son had been named Daniel too, except his son wasn't around anymore. He had lost him years ago in a car accident, an event that had quietly destroyed Michael's marriage and broken his heart beyond repair. That memory came rushing back, raw and merciless. He felt his knees weaken. He sat on a bench outside the store, his head buried in his hands. Passers-by looked at him, some recognizing the millionaire who once owned half the buildings in town, others seeing just a man beaten by life. He whispered to himself, why his name? Why now? Tears rolled down his cheeks, not just for the humiliation of a declined card, but for every night he had spent alone, drowning in guilt over things he could never change. A shadow appeared in front of him. It was Daniel again. "Are you okay, mister?" he asked gently. Michael quickly wiped his eyes, forcing a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine," but the boy didn't buy it. Children had a way of seeing through lies. He sat beside him, placing his little backpack on his lap. "My mom says people only say they're fine when they're not." Michael chuckled bitterly. "Your mom is a smart woman," Daniel nodded proudly. "She is. She works all the time, but she still makes sure I eat dinner with her every night." The boy's words pierced Michael like knives. He remembered how he had missed dinners, birthdays, even his son's last school play, because he was too busy making money. What good was all that wealth when he couldn't buy back those moments? Curiosity grew inside him. He wanted to know more about this boy, about the kind of family that raised such kindness in a world full of greed. "Where's your mom now?" Michael asked. Daniel looked down at his shoes. "She's working. She cleans offices at night. I wait for her at home, but sometimes it gets lonely. That's why I go to the store, just to see people." His voice was small, but his words carried the weight of years of silent struggle. Michael's heart twisted. Here was a boy with nothing, offering everything, while he himself had everything but had lost the only things that mattered. The irony was cruel. He whispered, "Doesn't anyone take care of you while your mom works?" Daniel shrugged. "Sometimes the neighbor checks in, but mostly it's just me. I'm used to it." Michael stared at the boy for a long time, then finally said, "You know, you remind me of someone I used to know." Daniel tilted his head curiously. "Who?" Michael's voice cracked. "My son." For the first time in years, he spoke openly about his loss. He told Daniel about the accident, about the empty chair at the dinner table, about how silence had become his closest companion. He admitted how he had drowned himself in work and wealth to avoid facing his grief, only to wake up one day and realize he was surrounded by walls, not people. Daniel listened quietly, his eyes wide with empathy, far beyond his age. When Michael finished, he expected pity or awkward silence. Instead, the boy put his small hand on Michael's and said, "My mom says when we lose someone, they're never really gone. They just hide in the people we meet later." Michael froze. The words hit him like lightning. Was this boy, was he somehow a reminder from life, or maybe even from his son? His heart ached, but for the first time in years, he also felt a strange warmth. Just then, a woman's voice called from a distance. "Daniel, where are you?" The boy jumped up, waving toward a woman in a simple uniform standing across the street. She looked exhausted but relieved to see her son. Michael watched her, realizing she was the kind of woman the world overlooked every day. Strong, silent, carrying burdens most people would never understand. Before leaving, Daniel turned back to Michael. "Mister, maybe you can have dinner with us sometime. My mom always cooks extra just in case." Michael's throat tightened. He nodded, unable to find words. The boy smiled, then ran off into his mother's arms. As Michael sat there, the paper bag of groceries at his feet, he realized his life had been cracked open in ways he hadn't expected. He had walked into that store thinking his greatest fear was losing money. But now he knew. His real fear was living without connection, without people who cared. And for the first time in years, he wanted to change. That night, Michael sat in his grand but empty mansion, the silence pressing down on him heavier than the marble walls and the chandeliers above. The house had once been a symbol of pride, proof of how far he had come. But now every corner mocked him. The dining table stretched for 12 feet, yet only one plate was set, and even that plate sat untouched. His fork scraped against porcelain as he pushed food around without appetite. The boy's words echoed in his mind. "My mum says, when we lose someone, they're never really gone. They just hide in the people we meet later." He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. It had been years since he let anyone close. Years of avoiding gatherings, refusing friendships, even shutting out family. His ex-wife had begged him to seek therapy after their son's death, but Michael had drowned himself in work instead. Work was predictable, money was controllable, unlike grief. But now, after meeting a little boy with the same name as his late son, the walls he had built began to crack. Sleep came late, but when it did, it dragged him into memories. He dreamed of his son again, the laughter, the small sneakers left by the door, the last hug before that fatal car ride. Michael woke with a gasp, drenched in sweat, his chest pounding. For years, he had tried to bury those memories, but tonight they returned sharper than ever. And strangely, instead of suffocating him, they pulled him towards something he had lost long ago, the need to feel human again. The next day, Michael found himself driving around town without a plan. He passed by the grocery store again, hoping, though he would never admit it, to see the boy. But Daniel wasn't there. He parked near a small park and got out, sitting on a bench watching children play. Their laughter stabbed his heart, but also gave him a strange comfort. As he sat there, he overheard two mothers talking. "That cleaning lady, I saw her again last night," one of them said. "She works 3 shifts just to make ends meet. That poor boy of hers, he's always alone." Michael's ears perked up. Could they be talking about Daniel's mother? The thought unsettled him. He rose from the bench and walked aimlessly, but his mind kept circling back. That boy had stepped forward with more courage and kindness than most adults he knew, yet his life was filled with struggles no child should bear. By evening, Michael was pacing his living room, debating with himself. Part of him wanted to forget and retreat into the comfort of isolation. Another part, the part that hadn't spoken in years, wanted to reach out. After hours of restless walking, he finally grabbed his coat and drove toward the poorer side of town. The part he rarely visited, even in his wealthiest days. The streets grew narrower, the buildings older, paint peeling from walls, children playing barefoot near broken sidewalks. He parked and asked a shopkeeper if he knew a woman who worked late-night cleaning shifts and had a son named Daniel. The man pointed down the block. "That must be Clara. Sweet woman, works harder than anyone I know." Apartment 3C. Michael climbed the creaking stairs, his heart pounding as though he were about to sign the biggest deal of his life. He reached the door and hesitated. What would he even say? That he was the millionaire whose card declined, and her son had saved him with crumpled bills. It sounded absurd. Still, he knocked gently. The door opened, and there she was, Clara. The exhaustion was visible on her face, but her eyes carried a quiet strength. Daniel peeked from behind her, his face lighting up when he saw Michael. "Mom, this is the man I told you about." Clara looked at Michael cautiously. "You're the one from the store?" Michael nodded, managing a small smile. "Yes, and I wanted to thank you. Your son. He showed me something I had forgotten." Daniel grinned. "I told you he's nice, Mom." Clara stepped aside reluctantly. "Come in." The apartment was small, 2 rooms, worn-out furniture, but tidy. The smell of soup filled the air. Michael glanced around, humbled by the simplicity. On the wall hung a picture of Clara and Daniel, both smiling despite their modest surroundings. It struck him harder than any luxury painting he had ever owned. They sat at the small dining table, and Clara served him a bowl of soup. "It's not much, but it's warm," she said quietly. Michael lifted the spoon, tasting it. It was simple, but it carried something no 5-star chef could recreate: love. For a moment he was silent. Then he said, "This is the best meal I've had in years." Daniel giggled. "A mom makes the best soup." Michael turned to Clara, his voice lower now. "I know you don't know me, and I probably don't deserve your kindness, but I'd like to help. Not as charity, but as gratitude." Clara's face stiffened. "I don't want pity, Mr. Michael," he said quickly. "Just Michael." She shook her head. I don't want my son growing up thinking people solve their problems with handouts. We manage. Her pride reminded him of his own, how he once refused to ask for help even as he crumbled inside. But he respected her stance. He leaned forward. I understand, but maybe I can help in other ways. Spend time with Daniel, perhaps. He reminds me of my son. Clara's eyes softened at the crack in his voice. You lost him? Michael nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Daniel, sensing the heaviness, reached across the table and placed his little hand over Michael's. It's okay. You have us now. The simplicity of the boy's words shattered him. For years, he had been living like a ghost, yet here was this child offering him belonging again. Over the next few days, Michael found himself returning to that modest apartment, sometimes bringing groceries, other times just sitting with Daniel and helping with homework. The boy would chatter endlessly, and Clara would watch cautiously but gradually, with less suspicion. Slowly, the emptiness inside Michael began to shift. But one evening, as they sat together, Clara received a phone call. Her face drained of color as she listened. She hung up, her hands trembling. What happened? Michael asked. She swallowed hard. The building owner, he's raising the rent again. I can't afford it. We'll have to leave by next month. Daniel's smile faded instantly. But Mom, where will we go? Clara pulled him close, whispering, We'll figure it out. But Michael could see the fear in her eyes. For someone who had built empires of wealth, watching a woman and her child fear losing their home shook him to the core. He wanted to help, but he remembered her pride. He clenched his fists under the table, his mind racing. Could he step in without insulting her dignity? Could he do it in a way that felt like partnership rather than charity? Daniel looked at Michael with pleading eyes. Mister, you won't let us be homeless, right? Michael's heart broke. He opened his mouth to answer, but his throat tightened. This was more than just money. It was about trust, about stepping into their lives without taking away their strength. And in that moment, he realized the biggest twist of all. Maybe saving them wasn't just about giving. It was about allowing himself to be saved, too. The night after Clara's call, Michael couldn't sleep. He lay in his king-size bed, staring at the ceiling, the sound of silence ringing too loud. His mansion, once a symbol of pride, now felt like a hollow palace, gold on the outside, but empty at its core. Every corner of the house reminded him of loneliness. He thought about Clara's small apartment, how cramped it was, how worn the furniture looked, and yet how full of warmth it felt compared to his cold, lifeless mansion. He tossed and turned, Daniel's pleading words replaying in his head. Mister, you won't let us be homeless, right? That sentence pierced him more than anything he had heard in years. For all his money, for all his past success, he had never felt the weight of responsibility the way he did now. It wasn't about status or business anymore. It was about a boy who had saved him when no one else dared to. The next morning, Michael sat in his study, staring at stacks of unopened mail. Among them were foreclosure warnings, debt collection letters, and lawsuits he had been avoiding. His empire wasn't just crumbling, it had already collapsed, and he had been living in denial. The humiliation at the store wasn't an isolated incident. His accounts were frozen, his assets were under review, and soon this mansion too might no longer be his. Still, when he thought of Clara and Daniel, a stubborn part of him wanted to fight back. Not for his empire, but for them. For once, he wanted to use his influence and skills, not to grow his wealth, but to protect someone else's home. He called an old acquaintance, a lawyer who had once handled property cases for him. Jim, I need you to check something, Michael said. His voice was tired but determined. There's a building on the east side, run-down apartments, owned by a landlord named Henry Moss. Find out everything about him, debts, legal issues, whatever you can. Jim chuckled on the other end. Michael, you still making power plays? I thought you were out of the game. I'm not playing, Michael said firmly. Just do this for me. That evening, Michael returned to Clara's apartment. Daniel ran to the door as soon as he heard the knock. Mr. Michael! He shouted with a grin. He grabbed Michael's hand and dragged him inside. Clara looked surprised but not unwelcome. She had started to notice that every time Michael came, her son seemed lighter, happier, as if the weight of loneliness on his little shoulders eased for a while. Clara served them tea, her tired eyes betraying her worry. Michael wanted to bring up the rent situation immediately, but he knew her pride wouldn't let her accept direct help. Instead, he tried gently. "Clara, I've been thinking. You work so hard day and night. You shouldn't have to worry about losing your home on top of that," she sighed. "That's life, Michael. We don't get to choose when trouble comes. But maybe we can choose how to fight it," he said quietly. Her eyes narrowed, sensing his intention. "If you're planning to pay my rent, don't. I told you before, I won't take charity." Michael leaned forward. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering partnership. Think of it this way. If I can use my experience to deal with landlords, legal systems, maybe we can make it easier for you. Not because you're weak, but because you deserve someone in your corner." Her gaze softened for a moment, but she shook her head. "I don't want Daniel growing up thinking the world owes him something. He has to learn to stand on his own." At that moment, Daniel, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "But Mom, don't you always say helping people is what makes the world better? If Mr. Michael wants to help, why can't we let him?" Clara looked at her son, speechless. Children had a way of cutting through walls adults built around themselves. Michael stayed silent, letting Daniel's words linger. Clara finally exhaled deeply. "Fine, but only if you promise this isn't pity." Michael nodded. "It's not pity, it's a promise." The following week, Jim called back with information. "Michael, you were right to ask. This landlord, Henry Moss, has skeletons in his closet. He's been evicting tenants unfairly, raising rents without permits, and there are complaints filed against him. But here's the kicker. He owes back taxes. A lot of them. If someone were to buy those debts, Henry would have no choice but to negotiate." Michael felt a spark he hadn't felt in years. Strategy, problem-solving, using the system against injustice. This was his territory. But then reality crashed down. He no longer had the capital he once did. His accounts were still frozen, his assets tangled in legal disputes. For the first time, he couldn't rely on wealth to back his will. That night, as he sat in his empty mansion, he faced a truth he could no longer run from. He was broke. Not almost broke, but fully broken. He had kept up appearances, surviving on scraps of credit and the illusion of wealth. But the truth was, he was just as vulnerable as Clara. And yet, when he thought of Daniel's trusting eyes, when he remembered the boy offering crumpled bills at the store, he knew he couldn't let them down. He whispered into the silence, "I'll find a way. I have to." The next day, Michael met Clara and Daniel again, this time with a plan forming in his mind. They were sitting around the small table, Daniel working on his homework. Michael leaned closer to Clara. "I might know how to stop Henry from raising your rent, but I need to be honest with you first. I'm not the man everyone thinks I am anymore." Clara frowned. "What do you mean?" He took a deep breath. "I used to have everything, money, business, influence. But it's all gone now. The world still sees me as a millionaire, but the truth is, I'm barely standing. The night at the store wasn't just an accident. My accounts are frozen. I'm broke." Clara stared at him, stunned. Daniel's pencil slipped from his hand. The silence that followed was suffocating. Finally, Clara spoke. "So why help us when you can't even help yourself?" Michael's eyes glistened. "Because your son reminded me what it means to care. And maybe helping you is the only way I can save myself," Daniel whispered softly. "See, Mom, he needs us too." For the first time since he had met her, Clara's eyes filled with tears. She quickly brushed them away, but her voice broke. "I don't know what kind of mess you're in, Michael, but if you're serious about fighting this landlord, then we'll stand with you, not as charity, as partners." At that moment, something shifted. Michael wasn't just the broken millionaire, and Clara wasn't just the overworked mother. Together, with Daniel's innocence binding them, they became something stronger, a small team, united not by wealth, but by survival and hope. But just when Michael thought he had found a new sense of purpose, a letter arrived at Clara's door. It was not from Henry Moss. It was from the City Housing Authority. The building had been marked for demolition within 6 months, declared unsafe for tenants. Clara's hands shook as she read it aloud. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. "Mom, are we going to lose our home for real this time?" Michael clenched the paper in his fists, anger rising inside him. The battle had just grown bigger than rent. Now it wasn't just about keeping a roof over Clara and Daniel's heads. It was about fighting a system that discarded lives as easily as paper. And as he looked at the letter, one thought burned in his mind: this time I won't fail them. The letter from the housing authority sat on the table like a silent bomb, its words heavier than bricks. Clara held it tightly, her knuckles pale. Daniel kept glancing between his mother and Michael, as if waiting for one of them to say it was a mistake, that everything would be fine. But no one said it. Michael leaned back in the chair, his jaw tight. For years, he had fought boardrooms, competitors, and hostile investors. He had thought those were battles, but this, seeing a child face the possibility of losing the only home he knew, this felt like war. 6 months, Clara whispered, her voice breaking. They're tearing this place down in 6 months. Where will we go, Michael? I don't have the money for another place. Not even close. Daniel tugged at her sleeve. Mom, maybe we can move into Mr. Michael's big house. He said it with the innocence only a child could muster, his eyes lighting up with hope. The words hit Michael like a punch. His mansion, vast and empty, could fit 10 families like Clara's. But the truth was, it wasn't his mansion for much longer. The banks were circling. Foreclosure was imminent, and soon even he might have no place to stay. He swallowed hard, hiding the truth from the boy. Daniel, we'll figure something out. I promise. Clara shot him a look, sharp and searching. She could sense there was more he wasn't saying, but for Daniel's sake, she didn't press. Instead, she said quietly, "Promises don't keep roofs over heads, Michael." Her words stung, but they were true. Still, deep inside, Michael felt something shift. He wasn't just fighting for them. He was fighting for himself, for the broken man he had become, for the father he had failed to be. That night, after leaving Clara's apartment, Michael sat in his car for hours. He replayed every detail of the letter, every hopeless expression on Clara's face, and every hopeful glance from Daniel. He thought about his son again, about the nights he had promised him he would always be there, promises that ended in an accident he could never undo. Maybe this was life's way of giving him one more chance. The next morning, Michael marched into the city housing authority. The building smelled of dust and old paper, the kind of place where lives were decided in ink and stamps. He approached the reception desk. "I need to speak to whoever signed off on the demolition order for Eastwood Apartments," he said firmly. The receptionist barely looked up. "Appointments only." Michael's patience thinned. "I'm not here to make an appointment. I'm here to stop a family from being thrown into the streets." The receptionist sighed, gesturing toward a closed office door. "Director Mason, but don't expect much. That building's been on the list for years." Michael knocked, then pushed the door open. Behind the desk sat a man in his 50s, glasses perched on his nose, flipping through a stack of papers. "What is it?" he asked without looking up. "I'm here about the Eastwood Apartments," Michael said. Mason finally looked up, raising an eyebrow. "And you are?" "Michael Reynolds," he replied. The name still carried weight. Mason's eyes flickered with recognition. The Michael Reynolds. Mason smirked. "Didn't think I'd see you here. Heard you were finished." Michael ignored the jab. "You can't demolish that building? Families live there. A child lives there." Mason leaned back. "The structure is unsafe. It's been on our radar for a long time. I don't make the rules, Mr. Reynolds. I just follow them." Michael's voice sharpened. "Or maybe you make deals. Who benefits if the building is torn down?" Mason's silence told him everything. This wasn't about safety. It was about profit. Developers wanted the land, and the city was eager to clear the way. Michael's old instincts kicked in. Corruption had a smell, and he could smell it now. He leaned across the desk. "I know how this works, Mason. Maybe I don't have the money I used to, but I still know how to fight. If you push this demolition, I'll expose every rotten deal you've made." Mason's smirk faded. Careful, Reynolds. You're not who you used to be. You don't have the power anymore. Michael stood tall, his voice steady. Maybe not, but I still have a voice, and I won't let you take their home without a fight. He left the office, his blood boiling, but his resolve stronger than ever. Outside, the cold air hit his face, and for the first time in years, he felt alive. Not because of money, not because of success, but because he had something worth fighting for again. Over the next week, Michael threw himself into action. He contacted old journalists who once wrote about his empire, feeding them hints about corruption in the housing authority. He reached out to community leaders, organizing small meetings in coffee shops and church basements. Clara, though hesitant at first, began to attend. She was quiet, but her presence gave weight to the cause. One evening after a meeting, Clara pulled Michael aside. "Why are you doing this, Michael? Really? You barely know us." Michael looked into her tired eyes. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything. And because your son reminded me I still have something to give." Her expression softened, but she remained guarded. "Don't make promises you can't keep. Daniel's already grown too attached to you." Michael felt a lump in his throat. He hadn't realized it, but Daniel had become the center of his days. The boy's laughter filled the void his own son once did. The thought of letting him down terrified him more than losing any business deal ever had. One night, as Michael was leaving their apartment, Daniel ran after him. "Mr. Michael," he called. Michael turned, smiling. "What is it, buddy?" Daniel hesitated, then whispered, "Are you my friend?" Michael's heart cracked wide open. He knelt down, meeting the boy's eyes. "More than that, Daniel." "I'm your family," Daniel grinned, hugging him tightly. Michael held him, feeling tears sting his eyes. For the first time since his own son's death, he allowed himself to feel love again. Raw, painful, healing love. But just as things seemed to turn, a new blow came. One of the journalists Michael had trusted called him late at night. "Michael," I looked into Mason. "You're right. There's corruption. But there's something else. They've linked your old company to one of the developers bidding for the land. If this goes public, they'll drag your name through the mud with it." Michael froze, the phone trembling in his hand. The empire he had built, the empire that had cost him his family, was now being used to destroy another family. His past sins had circled back, and this time it wasn't just his life at stake. Clara and Daniel were caught in the fire too. He sank into his chair, whispering to himself, "God, what have I done?" Michael couldn't sleep that night. The journalist's voice echoed in his head like a relentless drum. "Your old company is tied to the very developers bidding for the land." He sat at his kitchen table, the city lights glowing faintly through the tall windows. In front of him lay stacks of old files and contracts he had dug up from his storage boxes. Agreements, partnerships, acquisitions. Paper after paper reminded him of the empire he had built, the empire that had once made him untouchable. But now, those very documents were evidence of how blind he had been. In his hunger for growth, he had signed deals with ruthless companies, men whose smiles hid daggers. He had never cared then. As long as it made him richer, it was acceptable. And now, years later, those same men stood ready to destroy families like Clara's, families who had no voice, families who would be erased for the sake of luxury condos and profit. His chest tightened. It felt like standing at his son's grave all over again, facing the truth that his choices had cost someone everything. Except now, it wasn't just about the past. Clara and Daniel's future was hanging in the balance. The next morning, Michael walked to Eastwood Apartments, his breath fogging in the cool air. He found Clara waiting outside her door, arms crossed, her face a storm of questions. "You disappeared last night," she said, her voice sharp. "I had to dig into something," Michael admitted. "Clara, I need to tell you the truth." She studied him, cautious. "What truth?" He took a deep breath. "The developers trying to buy this land. They're tied to my old company. To me, indirectly, but still. I helped create the machine that's now trying to take your home." Clara's eyes widened, then hardened. So you're the reason Daniel and I might end up on the street. Michael's throat tightened. I didn't know back then. I didn't see where it would lead, but now I do. And I'm trying to make it right. Her voice cracked, fury laced with pain. You walk into our lives acting like some savior, but you're part of the problem. Do you know what it feels like, Michael? To look your child in the eye and not know where he'll sleep in 6 months? He stepped closer, desperate. Clara, please. I'm not the same man I was. I can't erase the past, but I can fight it for you. For Daniel. She shook her head, tears brimming. Don't make this about redemption. Don't use us as your chance to feel human again. The words cut deep. For a moment, Michael had no answer. But then, Daniel's laughter spilled out from inside the apartment, calling for his mother. Clara wiped her tears quickly and walked back inside, leaving Michael standing there in the cold, with a silence heavier than stone. That day, Michael doubled down. He met with the journalist again, sliding a thick folder across the table. "Print it all," he said. The journalist raised an eyebrow. "You realize this puts you at the center of it. They'll crucify you, Michael. The public loves a fallen king to blame." Michael's voice was steady. "If that's the price, so be it." The story broke within days. Headlines screamed across the city. Former mogul linked to developers in Eastwood controversy. Michael Reynolds' empire built on deals now hurting families. Reporters swarmed his apartment. Cameras flashed whenever he stepped outside. The man who had once been admired now became the villain. Online, strangers hurled insults, calling him a parasite, a fraud, a hypocrite. Clara saw the news too. That evening, Michael went to her door, but she didn't let him in. She stood in the doorway, Daniel asleep behind her. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she whispered. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Michael replied softly. "I'm asking for a chance to fix this." Her eyes searched his face, torn between anger and the faintest glimmer of hope. "You better not break his heart," she said, and closed the door gently. The backlash intensified. Mason, the housing director, seized the opportunity. In a press conference, he painted Michael as the root of the problem. "The Eastwood demolition is about safety," Mason said smoothly, "but let's not ignore the man who profited from these developers for years. Michael Reynolds himself." Michael watched the broadcast, fists clenched. Mason was cunning, turning the city's anger into his shield. If Michael fell, Mason and the developers would walk free, but then came an unexpected twist. A group of Eastwood residents, led by a fiery retired teacher named Mrs. Alvarez, began chanting his name outside City Hall. "Michael stood with us when no one else did," she shouted into a megaphone. "He may have made mistakes, but he's fighting now. And we're fighting with him." The crowd echoed, their voices swelling. For the first time, Michael realized people weren't just blaming him. Some were rallying because of him. Not because he was a millionaire, but because he was willing to risk his name for them. Still, Clara remained distant. Her trust was a fragile thread. One evening, she confronted him quietly in the hallway. "Daniel thinks the world of you," she said. "If this all crumbles, what will you say to him? How will you explain that promises don't stop bulldozers?" Michael's heart ached. "Then I'll stand in front of those bulldozers myself if I have to." She studied him, seeing the weight in his eyes, the sincerity in his voice. But she only whispered, "Words, Michael. They've broken us enough." The following week brought another twist. Mason, cornered by journalists probing deeper, shifted tactics. He leaked personal files, Michael's bankruptcy papers, foreclosure notices, unpaid debts. Suddenly, the city knew not only his past sins, but his present struggles. The image of a once powerful man, now barely holding himself together, filled headlines. Daniel saw Michael on TV one night, his small voice trembling as he asked his mother, "Is Mr. Michael poor like us?" Clara hesitated, then nodded gently. "Yes, baby. Maybe even poorer." Daniel thought for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Then we're family for real." When Clara told Michael what Daniel had said, he nearly broke down. That boy, with nothing but innocence, had given him more grace than the entire world ever had. But the battle was far from over. Demolition equipment had been scheduled. Permits were being fast-tracked. Mason's allies in the council were pushing harder than ever. Michael knew the fight had reached a point of no return. He had one last card to play, a stack of incriminating emails from years ago, proving that Mason had accepted bribes from developers, emails Michael had stumbled upon in his old files. Exposing them would not only destroy Mason, but might also destroy Michael completely, tying him forever to the corruption he had once ignored. As he sat in his apartment, the emails glowing on his laptop screen, Michael whispered to himself, "Is saving them worth losing everything I have left?" For the first time in years, he already knew the answer. Michael stared at the glowing emails on his laptop, his hand hovering over the mouse. Every line of text screamed betrayal, corruption, and guilt. If he released them, Mason would fall, but so would he. His name would forever be tied to the rot that had destroyed families. He would never be seen as the man who tried to help, only as the man who once profited from their pain. For a long moment, he sat frozen. Then his phone buzzed. It was a video message from Daniel. The boy's face filled the screen, his voice shaky but brave. "Mr. Michael, Mum says they might take our home soon, but I don't care if we live here or somewhere else. I just want us all to stay together. You, me, and Mom, because family doesn't quit, right?" Michael's vision blurred with tears. That was the moment. The choice was no longer about his name, his past, or his empire. It was about keeping a promise to a little boy who had already lost too much. The next morning, Michael walked into City Hall carrying a folder of printed emails. He stepped onto the podium during a council meeting, his voice steady despite the cameras flashing in his face. "My name is Michael Reynolds," he began. "I was once celebrated as a businessman, then disgraced as a failure. I built wealth on deals I never questioned, and those same deals are now destroying lives. I won't hide from that truth anymore. But I also won't stand by while men like Director Mason line their pockets by tearing families apart. Here is the proof of his corruption." He held the folder high, then dropped it onto the table in front of the council. Gasps filled the room. Mason's face went pale. Reporters surged forward. The fallout was immediate. Mason was arrested within days, the demolition order suspended, and the Eastwood apartments given a chance to fight for renovation instead of destruction. The residents poured into the streets, cheering Michael's name, not as a millionaire, not as a mogul, but as a man who chose to burn his own reputation to give them hope. But Michael knew the cost. His face was everywhere, branded as the businessman who had betrayed his city and then tried to save it. Investors severed ties, banks accelerated their foreclosures, and soon his mansion was gone. He packed his few belongings into a single suitcase, the weight of his choices pressing down but also strangely lifting him. When he went to say goodbye to Clara, she looked at him with a softness he hadn't seen before. "You gave up everything," she whispered. Michael smiled faintly. "It was never mine to keep." Daniel ran into his arms, holding him tightly. "You're not going, right? You promised we're family." Michael knelt, holding the boy close. "Family isn't about houses or money, Daniel. It's about never leaving when things get hard. And I'm not leaving you." For a long moment Clara watched, her eyes glistening. Then with a quiet strength she said, "Stay, we don't have much, Michael. But maybe that's exactly what you need." So Michael stayed. Not in a mansion, not as a millionaire, but in a small apartment where laughter echoed louder than walls could contain. He worked alongside Clara and the neighbors, helping rebuild Eastwood from the inside. Not as a savior, but as a man finally learning what it meant to belong. Years later, no one remembered Michael Reynolds, the tycoon, but in Eastwood, people remembered the man who gave up everything to keep one promise. And in Daniel's heart, he wasn't a fallen millionaire. He was simply Dad. Moral lesson: true wealth is not measured in money, power, or the empires we build. It is measured in the sacrifices we make for others, the promises we keep when it costs us everything, and the love we give without expecting anything in return. Sometimes life gives us a second chance, not to fix our past, but to create a better future for someone else.